Such was the complexity of things. For what happened to her, especially staying with the Ramsays, was to be made to feel violently two opposite things at the same time. That's what you feel was one, that's what I feel was the other, and then they fought together in her mind, as now. It is so beautiful, so exciting, this love, that I tremble on the verge of it, and offer, quite out of my own habit, to look for a brooch on a beach. Also, it is the stupidest, the most barbaric of human passions, and turns a nice young man with a profile like a gem (Paul's was exquisite) into a bully with a crowbar in the Mile End Road. Yet, she said to herself, from the dawn of time odes have been sung to love, wreaths heaped and roses, and if you asked 9 people out of 10, they would say they wanted nothing but this. While the women, judging from her own experience, would all the time be feeling, this is not what we want. There is nothing more tedious, puerile, and inhumane than love. Yet it is also beautiful and necessary. Well then, she asked, somehow expecting the others to go on with the argument, as if in an argument like this one threw one's own little bolt, which fell short, obviously, and left the others to carry it on. So she listened again to what they were saying, in case they should throw any light upon the question of love. And then, said Mr. Banks, there is that liquid the English call coffee. Oh, coffee, said Mrs. Ramsay, but it was much rather a question. She was thoroughly roused, Lily could see, and talked very emphatically, of real butter and clean milk. Speaking with warmth and eloquence, she described the iniquity of the English dairy system, and in what state milk was delivered at the door, and was about to prove her charges, for she had gone into the matter, when all round the table, beginning with Andrew in the middle, like a fire leaping from tuft to tuft of furze, her children laughed. Her husband laughed. She was laughed at, fire encircled, and forced to veil her crest, dismount her batteries, and only retaliate by displaying the raillery and ridicule of the table to Mr. Banks as an example of what one suffered if one attacked the prejudices of the British public. Purposely, however, for she had it on her mind that Lily, who had helped her with Mr. Tansley, was out of things, she exempted her from the rest, said, Lily anyhow agrees with me, and so drew her in, a little fluttered, a little startled, for she was thinking about love. They were both out of things, Mrs. Ramsay had been thinking, both Lily and Charles Tansley. Both suffered from the glow of the other two. He, it was clear, felt himself utterly in the cold. No woman would look at him with Paul Rayleigh in the room. Poor fellow. Still, he had his dissertation, the influence of somebody on something. He could take care of himself. With Lily it was different. She faded under Minter's glow, became more inconspicuous than ever in her little grey dress, with her little puckered face and her little Chinese eyes. Everything about her was so small. Yet, thought Mrs. Ramsay, comparing her with Minter, as she claimed her help, for Lily should bear her out, she talked no more about her dairies than her husband did about his boots. He would talk by the hour about his boots. Of the two, Lily at 40 will be the better. There was in Lily a thread of something, a flare of something of her own, which Mrs. Ramsay liked very much indeed. But no man would, she feared. Obviously not, unless it were a much older man like William Banks. But then he cared, well, Mrs. Ramsay sometimes thought that he cared since his wife's death, perhaps for her. He was not in love, of course. It was one of those unclassified affections of which there are so many. Oh, but nonsense, she thought. William must marry Lily. They have so many things in common. Lily is so fond of flowers. They are both cold and aloof and rather self-sufficing. She must arrange for them to take a long walk together. Foolishly, she had set them opposite each other. That could be remedied tomorrow. If it were fine, they should go for a picnic. Everything seemed possible, everything seemed right. Just now, but this cannot last, she thought, dissociating herself from the moment while they were all talking about boots. Just now she had reached security. She hovered like a hawk suspended, like a flag floated in an element of joy which filled every nerve of her body fully and sweetly, not noisily, solemnly rather, for it arose, she thought, looking at them all eating there, from husband and children and friends, all of which rising in this profound stillness. She was helping William Banks to one very small piece more and peered into the depths of the earthenware pot, seemed now for no special reason to stay there like a smoke, like a fume rising upwards, holding them safe together. Nothing need be said, nothing could be said. There it was, all around them. It partook, she felt, carefully helping Mr. Banks to a specially tender piece of eternity, as she had already felt about something different once before that afternoon. There is a coherence in things, a stability. Something she meant is immune from change and shines out. She glanced at the window with its ripple of reflected lights, in the face of the flowing, the fleeting, the spectral, like a ruby, so that again tonight she had the feeling she had had once today already, of peace, of rest. Of such moments, she thought, the thing is made that remains forever after. This would remain. Yes, she assured William Banks, there is plenty for everybody. Andrew, she said, hold your plate lower or I shall spill it. The boeuf en daube was a perfect triumph. Here, she felt, putting the spoon down, was the still space that lies about the heart of things, where one could move or rest, could wait now. They were all helped, listening, could then, like a hawk which lapses suddenly from its high station, flaunt and sink on laughter easily, resting her whole weight upon what at the other end of the table her husband was saying about the square root of 1253, which happened to be the number on his railway ticket. What did that all mean? To this day she had no notion. A square root? What was that? Her sons knew. She leaned on them, on cubes and square roots. That was what they were talking about now. On Voltaire and Madame de Staël, on the character of Napoleon, on the French system of land tenure, on Lord Rosebery, on Creevy's memoirs. She let it uphold her and sustain her, this admirable fabric of the masculine intelligence, which ran up and down, crossed this way and that, like iron girders spanning the swaying fabric, upholding the world so that she could trust herself to it utterly, even shut her eyes, or flicker them for a moment as a child staring up from its pillow winks at the myriad layers of the leaves of a tree. Then she woke up. It was still being fabricated. William Banks was praising the Waverley novels. He read one of them every 6 months, he said. And why should that make Charles Tansley angry? He rushed in, all, thought Miss Ramsay, because Prue will not be nice to him. He rushed in and denounced the Waverley novels when he knew nothing about it whatsoever, Mrs. Ramsay thought, observing him rather than listening to what he said. She could see how it was from his manner. He wanted to assert himself, and so it would always be with him till he got his professorship or married his wife, and so need not be always saying, I, for that was what his criticism of poor Sir Walter, or perhaps it was Jane Austen, amounted to. I. He was thinking of himself, and the impression he was making, as she could tell by the sound of his voice, and his emphasis and his uneasiness. Success would be good for him. At any rate, they were off again. Now she need not listen. It could not last, she knew, but at the moment her eyes were so clear that they seemed to go round the table, unveiling each of these people and their thoughts and their feelings without effort, like a light stealing under water so that its ripples and the reeds in it, and the minnows balancing themselves, and the sudden silent trout are all lit up, hanging, trembling. So she saw them, she heard them. But whatever they said had also this quality, as if what they said was like the movement of a trout when, at the same time, one can see the ripple and the gravel, something to the right, something to the left, and the whole is held together. For whereas in active life she would be netting and separating one thing from another, she would be saying she liked the Waverley novels or had not read them. She would be urging herself forward. Now she said nothing. For the moment she hung suspended. "Ah, but how long do you think it'll last?" said somebody. It was as if she had antennae trembling out from her, which, intercepting certain sentences, forced them upon her attention. This was one of them. She scented danger for her husband. A question like that would lead almost certainly to something being said which reminded him of his own failure. How long would he be read? He would think at once. William Banks, who was entirely free from all such vanity, laughed and said he attached no importance to changes in fashion. Who could tell what was going to last in literature, or indeed in anything else? Let us enjoy what we do enjoy, he said. His integrity seemed to Mrs. Ramsay quite admirable. He never seemed for a moment to think, but how does this affect me? But then, if you had the other temperament, which must have praise, which must have encouragement, naturally you began, and she knew that Mr. Ramsay was beginning to be uneasy, to want somebody to say, "Oh, but your work will last, Mr. Ramsay," or something like that. He showed his uneasiness quite clearly now by saying, with some irritation, that anyhow Scott, or was it Shakespeare, would last him his lifetime. He said it irritably. Everybody, she thought, felt a little uncomfortable without knowing why. Then Minta Doyle, whose instinct was fine, said bluffly, absurdly, that she did not believe that anyone really enjoyed reading Shakespeare. Mr. Ramsay said grimly, but his mind was turned away again, that very few people liked it as much as they said they did. But, he added, there is considerable merit in some of the plays, nevertheless. And Mrs. Ramsay saw that it would be all right for the moment anyhow. He would laugh at Minta, and she, Mrs. Ramsay saw, realizing his extreme anxiety about himself, would in her own way see that he was taken care of, and praise him somehow or other. But she wished it was not necessary. Perhaps it was her fault that it was necessary. Anyhow, she was free now to listen to what Paul Rayleigh was trying to say about books one had read as a boy. They lasted, he said. He had read some of Tolstoy at school. There was one he always remembered, but he had forgotten the name. Russian names were impossible, said Mrs. Ramsay. Vronsky, said Paul. He remembered that because he always thought it such a good name for a villain. Vronsky, said Mrs. Ramsay. Oh, Anna Karenina. But that did not take them very far. Books were not in their line. No, Charles Tansley would put them both right in a second about books. But it was all so mixed up with, am I saying the right thing? Am I making a good impression? That after all one knew more about him, Tansley, than about Tolstoy, whereas what Paul said was about the thing, simply, not himself. Like all stupid people, he had a kind of modesty too, a consideration for what you were feeling, which, once in a way at least, she found attractive. Now he was thinking not about himself or about Tolstoy, but whether she was cold, whether she felt a draught, whether she would like a pear. No, she said, she did not want a pear. Indeed, she had been keeping guard over the dish of fruit without realizing it, jealously, hoping that nobody would touch it. Her eyes had been going in and out among the curves and shadows of the fruit, among the rich purples of the lowland grapes, then over the horny ridge of the shell, putting a yellow against the purple, a curved shape against a round shape, without knowing why she did it, or why every time she did it she felt more and more serene. Until, oh, what a pity that they should do it, a hand reached out, took a pear, and spoiled the whole thing. In sympathy, she looked at Rose. She looked at Rose sitting between Jasper and Prue. How odd that one's child should do that. How odd to see them sitting there in a row, her children. Jasper, Rose, Prue, Andrew, almost silent, but with some joke of their own going on, she guessed, from the twitching at their lips. It was something quite apart from everything else, something they were hoarding up to laugh over in their own room. It was not about their father, she hoped. No, she thought not. What was it, she wondered, sadly rather, for it seemed to her that they would laugh when she was not there. There was all that hoarded behind those rather set, still, mask-like faces, for they did not join in easily. They were like watchers, surveyors, a little raised or set apart from the grown-up people. But when she looked at Prue tonight, she saw that this was not now quite true of her. She was just beginning, just moving, just descending. The faintest light was on her face, as if the glow of Minta opposite, some excitement, some anticipation of happiness was reflected in her, as if the sun of the love of men and women rose over the rim of the tablecloth, and without knowing what it was, she bent towards it and greeted it. She kept looking at Minta, shyly yet curiously, so that Mrs. Ramsay looked from one to the other and said, speaking to Prue in her own mind, "You will be as happy as she is one of these days. You will be much happier," she added, "because you are my daughter," she meant. Her own daughter must be happier than other people's daughters. But dinner was over. It was time to go. They were only playing with things on their plates. She would wait until they had done laughing at some story her husband was telling. He was having a joke with Minta about a bet. Then she would get up. She liked Charles Tansley, she thought suddenly. She liked his laugh. She liked him for being so angry with Paul and Minta. She liked his awkwardness. There was a lot in that young man, after all. And Lily, she thought, putting her napkin beside her plate. She always has some joke of her own. One need never bother about Lily. She waited. She tucked her napkin under the edge of her plate. Well, were they done now? No, that story had led to another story. Her husband was in great spirits tonight, and wishing, she supposed, to make it all right with old Augustus after that scene about the soup, had drawn him in. They were telling stories about someone they had both known at college. She looked at the window, in which the candle flames burned brighter now that the panes were black, and looking at that outside, the voices came to her very strangely, as if they were voices at a service in a cathedral, for she did not listen to the words. The sudden bursts of laughter, and then one voice, Minta's, speaking alone, reminded her of men and boys crying out the Latin words of a service in some Roman Catholic cathedral. She waited. Her husband spoke. He was repeating something, and she knew it was poetry from the rhythm and the ring of exaltation and melancholy in his voice. "Come out and climb the garden path, Luriana Lurili. The China rose is all abloom and buzzing with the yellow bee." The words, she was looking at the window, sounded as if they were floating like flowers on water out there, cut off from them all, as if no one had said them, but they had come into existence of themselves. And all the lives we ever lived, and all the lives to be, are full of trees and changing leaves. She did not know what they meant, but, like music, the words seemed to be spoken by her own voice, outside herself, saying quite easily and naturally what had been in her mind the whole evening while she said different things. She knew, without looking round, that everyone at the table was listening to the voice, saying, I wonder if it seems to you, Luriana Lurili, with the same sort of relief and pleasure that she had, as if this were at last the natural thing to say, this were their own voice speaking. But the voice stopped. She looked round. She made herself get up. Augustus Carmichael had risen and, holding his table napkin so that it looked like a long white robe, he stood chanting, "To see the kings go riding by over lawn and daisy lea, with their palm leaves and cedar, Luriana, Lurilee." And as she passed him, he turned slightly towards her, repeating the last words, "Luriana, Lurilee," and bowed to her, as if he did her homage. Without knowing why, she felt that he liked her better than he had ever done before, and with a feeling of relief and gratitude she returned his bow and passed through the door which he held open for her. It was necessary now to carry everything a step further. With her foot on the threshold, she waited a moment longer in a scene which was vanishing even as she looked, and then, as she moved and took Minta's arm and left the room, it changed. It shaped itself differently. It had become, she knew, giving one last look at it over her shoulder, it had become already the past.